The fluorescent lights of the naval base mess hall cast harsh shadows across the metal tables as Lieutenant Sarah Chen walked through the entrance, her combat boots making soft, squeaking sounds against the polished floor. The smell of overcooked vegetables and processed meat hung heavy in the air, mixing with the distinct scent of disinfectant that seemed to permeate every military facility she had ever been in. Sarah had arrived at the base just 3 hours ago, her transfer papers still crisp in her uniform pocket. The official story was simple enough. She was a communications specialist being reassigned to provide technical support for the base's intelligence operations. What the paperwork didn't mention, and what none of the personnel on base knew, was that Sarah Chen was one of the most highly trained operatives in the Navy SEALs, with 6 years of classified missions under her belt. The decision to go undercover had come from the highest levels of command. There had been reports of security breaches at the base, sensitive information being leaked, and equipment going missing. Traditional investigations had turned up nothing, so they needed someone who could blend in, observe, and identify the source of the problems without raising suspicion. Sarah grabbed a plastic tray from the stack near the serving line, noting how the other personnel moved around the space. Groups of sailors clustered together at various tables, their conversations a mix of complaints about duty assignments, jokes about officers, and discussions of weekend plans. She recognized the familiar rhythm of military life, the way people found comfort in routine and camaraderie, even in the most challenging circumstances. The serving line moved slowly, giving Sarah time to study the layout of the mess hall and the people around her. She had learned long ago that successful intelligence gathering was less about dramatic confrontations and more about patience, observation, and the ability to notice details that others missed. Every conversation overheard, every interaction witnessed, every small deviation from normal patterns could provide valuable information. As she moved through the line, accepting portions of what appeared to be some form of beef stew and mashed potatoes, Sarah became aware of a group of male recruits at a table near the center of the room. They were loud, animated, and seemed to be the type who enjoyed being the center of attention. She had encountered similar groups many times before. Young men who had joined the military with something to prove, who sometimes let their egos override their better judgment. The leader of the group was obvious even from a distance. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of confident bearing that could either indicate genuine leadership ability or dangerous overconfidence. His name tape read Johnson, and from his posture and the way the others deferred to him, Sarah guessed he had appointed himself the unofficial leader of their little clique. Sarah found an empty table in a corner of the room, positioning herself so she could observe most of the mess hall while appearing to focus on her meal. The beef stew was exactly as unappetizing as it looked. But she had eaten far worse things during survival training and combat missions. Food was fuel, nothing more, and she had learned to separate taste from necessity long ago. As she ate, Sarah listened to the conversations around her, filtering through complaints about training schedules and discussions of upcoming leave time, searching for anything that might be relevant to her mission. Most of what she heard was typical military small talk, but she made mental notes of names, relationships, and any mentions of equipment or procedures that seemed out of place. The group of recruits near the center of the room was getting progressively louder, their conversation becoming more boisterous with each passing minute. Sarah could see that they were showing off for each other, each trying to top the others with stories of their accomplishments or plans for proving themselves. It was a dynamic she had witnessed countless times, young soldiers trying to establish their place in the hierarchy through bravado and posturing. Johnson seemed to be regaling the others with a story about a training exercise where he had supposedly outperformed more experienced personnel. The details of his account didn't quite add up to Sarah's trained ear, but his companions were hanging on every word, occasionally interjecting with their own embellishments or expressions of admiration. Sarah finished her meal methodically, taking time to study the mess hall's security arrangements and emergency exits. The building had two main entrances, several windows that could potentially serve as alternate escape routes, and what appeared to be a service entrance near the kitchen area. The lighting was adequate, but not ideal for close observation, and the acoustic properties of the space meant that conversations could be overheard from considerable distances if one knew how to listen. As she prepared to leave, Sarah noticed that Johnson's group had grown quiet and were looking in her direction. She had been careful not to stare or appear obviously interested in their conversation, but something had caught their attention. Perhaps it was simply the fact that she was new, or maybe one of them had noticed her subtle surveillance techniques. Johnson stood up from his table, his movement causing the others to follow suit. They approached her table with the kind of casual swagger that Sarah recognized as barely controlled aggression looking for an outlet. She remained seated, continuing to eat her meal as if she hadn't noticed their approach, while mentally assessing the situation and considering her options. The mess hall had grown quieter around them, other diners sensing the potential for confrontation and either leaving the area or turning their attention to watch what might unfold. Sarah could feel the weight of numerous eyes upon them, and she knew that whatever happened next would likely be the subject of base gossip for weeks to come. Johnson reached her table first, placing his hands on the surface and leaning forward slightly in what was clearly meant to be an intimidating posture. His companions arranged themselves around the table, effectively boxing her in and cutting off easy escape routes. It was a classic intimidation tactic, one that relied on psychological pressure and the implied threat of physical confrontation. "Well, well," Johnson said, his voice carrying the kind of false friendliness that barely concealed hostility. "Looks like we've got ourselves a new face around here. Don't think I've seen you before, sweetheart." The use of the diminutive term was clearly intended to be provocative, a way of establishing dominance by reducing her to a stereotype rather than treating her as a fellow service member. Sarah continued eating, not acknowledging his presence or his words, which only seemed to increase his irritation. One of his companions, a stocky recruit with the name Tape Rodriguez, stepped closer to her chair. "Hey, Johnson's talking to you," he said, his voice carrying a note of menace. "Where I come from, it's considered rude not to answer when someone's being friendly." Sarah took another spoonful of her meal, chewing slowly and deliberately, before finally looking up at them with an expression of mild curiosity. "I'm sorry," she said, in a voice that was perfectly calm and controlled. "Did you need something? I was just trying to enjoy my dinner." Her response seemed to catch them off guard. They had clearly expected either fear or defiance, and her matter-of-fact tone disrupted their intended dynamic. Johnson straightened up slightly, reassessing his approach, but clearly not willing to back down in front of his friends and the watching crowd. "See, here's the thing," Johnson continued, his voice getting louder. "This is kind of our spot, our territory, if you will, and when new people show up, especially when they think they can just sit here and ignore us, well, that creates a problem." The other recruits nodded and murmured their agreement, feeding off their leader's energy and the attention they were receiving from the other diners. Sarah could see that they were committed to this course of action now, their pride and group dynamics making it difficult for them to back down without losing face. Sarah set down her spoon and looked around the table at each of them in turn, her expression remaining calm and unthreatening. She had been in similar situations before, though usually in much more dangerous circumstances and foreign locations. The principle remained the same: assess the threat level, consider the objectives, and choose the response that best served the mission. "I understand that you gentlemen feel this is your space," she said, her tone remaining conversational. "But I'm just here to eat my meal and then I'll be on my way. I'm not looking for any trouble." Her reasonable response seemed to frustrate them further. They had clearly been hoping to provoke a reaction that would justify escalating the situation. But Sarah's professional demeanor was making it difficult for them to cast themselves as the wronged party. The tension in the mess hall was palpable now, with conversations at other tables dying away as more people turned their attention to the confrontation. Sarah was acutely aware that her response to this situation would likely determine how she was perceived by the base personnel for the duration of her mission, and that reputation could either help or hinder her investigation. Johnson leaned forward again, his face closer to hers now, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was a menacing whisper. "See, that's where you're wrong, sweetheart. You became our problem the moment you walked in here with that attitude, thinking you're better than everyone else." The accusation was unfair and based on nothing more than her failure to respond to their initial provocations, but Sarah recognized it as a common tactic, creating a justification for aggression by attributing negative qualities to the target that must be corrected through confrontation. Sarah remained seated, her hands resting calmly on the table, as Johnson continued to lean over her, his breath carrying the faint smell of the coffee he had been drinking. The 4 other recruits had positioned themselves strategically around her chair, creating what they clearly believed was an inescapable trap. Rodriguez stood to her left, close enough that she could see the small scar above his eyebrow, while 2 others whose name tags read Mitchell and Barnes flanked her right side. The 5th member of their group, Patterson, had moved behind her chair, effectively blocking any attempt at a normal exit. "You know what I think?" Johnson continued, his voice getting more aggressive with each word. "I think you're one of those types who comes in here thinking she's hot stuff. Probably got some desk job and thinks that makes her special. Well, let me tell you something, Princess. Out here in the real military, respect is earned. And you haven't earned anything yet." The mess hall had grown completely silent now, except for the distant sounds of kitchen staff cleaning up after the dinner service. Every person in the room was watching the confrontation unfold, some with obvious discomfort at the aggressive behavior they were witnessing, others with the kind of morbid curiosity that drew people to watch conflicts they had no intention of preventing. Sarah could see a few senior enlisted personnel at tables near the far wall, but none of them seemed inclined to intervene. This was partly due to military culture, where lower-ranking personnel were often expected to handle their own disputes without running to authority figures. But she suspected it was also because they wanted to see how the new person would handle herself under pressure. "Listen," Sarah said, her voice still calm but with a slight edge that suggested her patience was beginning to wear thin. "I really don't want any problems with anyone. I'm new here, I'm trying to do my job, and I'd appreciate it if you'd just let me finish my meal in peace." Her continued reasonableness seemed to infuriate Johnson even more. He had clearly expected her to either cower in fear or respond with matching aggression, either of which would have given him the justification he needed to escalate further. Her refusal to play along with his script was undermining his authority in front of his friends and the watching crowd. Rodriguez decided to add his voice to the confrontation, apparently feeling that his leader needed support. "See, that's the problem right there," he said, pointing a finger uncomfortably close to Sarah's face. "You're not listening. Johnson here is trying to explain how things work around this base, and you're sitting there acting like you're too good to pay attention." Mitchell and Barnes nodded their agreement, stepping slightly closer to her chair. Mitchell was tall and thin with the kind of nervous energy that suggested he was looking for any excuse to prove himself to the others. Barnes was shorter but more muscular, with the build of someone who spent serious time in the gym and the attitude of someone who believed physical strength automatically translated to social dominance. Patterson, still standing behind her chair, placed his hands on the back of her seat and leaned down until his mouth was near her ear. "You know, new girl," he said in what he probably thought was a threatening whisper, "it would be a real shame if you had some kind of accident during training exercises. Lots of things can go wrong when people aren't watching out for each other." The implied threat was clear and unmistakable, and Sarah felt something cold and hard settle in her stomach. These weren't just immature recruits playing dominance games anymore. They were talking about potentially causing her physical harm if she didn't submit to their intimidation tactics. The situation had crossed a line from harassment into something much more serious. Sarah slowly pushed her chair back from the table, the movement causing Patterson to straighten up and step aside slightly. She stood up with fluid, controlled movements, her posture remaining relaxed despite the tension of the situation. As she rose to her full height, she was pleased to note that she was actually taller than 3 of the 5 recruits, and only slightly shorter than Johnson and Mitchell. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice taking on a tone that was still calm but carried unmistakable authority. "I think there's been a misunderstanding here. You seem to think that I'm someone who can be intimidated or threatened. Let me assure you that you are absolutely incorrect about that." The change in her demeanor was subtle but unmistakable. Where before she had seemed like a potentially easy target, now there was something in her bearing that suggested these 5 men might have made a serious error in judgment. Her posture was perfectly balanced, her hands loose at her sides, and her eyes had taken on the kind of focused intensity that predators recognize in other predators. Johnson, however, was too committed to his course of action to recognize the warning signs. His pride was on the line now, and backing down would mean losing face in front of his companions and everyone else in the mess hall. Instead of reconsidering his approach, he decided to double down on the aggression. "Oh, so now you're threatening us?" he said, his voice getting louder again. "See, boys, I told you she was trouble. Comes in here acting all innocent, and now she's making threats against military personnel. That's a serious offense, you know." The accusation was completely backwards. They had been the ones making threats, but Sarah recognized it as another common tactic. When intimidation failed, the next step was often to try to manipulate the situation so that any response from the target could be characterized as the real aggression, making the original aggressors appear to be the victims. Rodriguez stepped even closer, now close enough that she could smell the aftershave he had used that morning. "Yeah," he said, puffing up his chest in what he clearly thought was an intimidating display. "Maybe we need to teach her some respect, show her how things work around here." Mitchell and Barnes moved closer as well, the circle around Sarah tightening as they prepared for what they apparently believed would be an easy confrontation with someone they had categorized as a helpless target. Patterson moved back into position behind her, cutting off her retreat once again. Sarah looked around at each of them in turn, her expression giving away nothing of her thoughts or intentions. To an outside observer, she might have appeared trapped and outnumbered. But her training had taught her to see situations like this very differently. She wasn't surrounded by 5 potential attackers. She was standing in the center of 5 targets who had obligingly arranged themselves within striking distance. "You know," Sarah said, her voice taking on an almost conversational tone, "in my experience, when people resort to threats and intimidation tactics, it's usually because they don't have any real power or authority to get what they want through legitimate means." The observation hit home, and she could see anger flashing in Johnson's eyes. He was clearly not used to having his authority questioned, especially not by someone he had assumed would be an easy target for his bullying tactics. "That's it," Johnson said, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "I've had enough of your mouth. Maybe it's time someone taught you some manners." He took a step forward, his intention clear, and Sarah felt the familiar calm that always settled over her in moments of impending violence. Time seemed to slow down as her training kicked in, her mind automatically cataloging the positions of all 5 men, calculating angles and distances, identifying the optimal sequence of responses that would neutralize the threats with minimum effort and maximum efficiency. The mess hall was completely silent now, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Even the kitchen staff had stopped their cleaning to watch what was about to unfold. Sarah could sense that some of the observers wanted to intervene, but military culture and the suddenness of the escalation had frozen them in place. Johnson raised his hand. Whether to grab her or strike her was unclear, but Sarah had seen enough. The moment his arm began to move toward her, she shifted into action with the kind of explosive speed that comes from years of intensive training and real combat experience. Her right hand shot upward, intercepting his wrist and redirecting his momentum while simultaneously stepping forward and to the side, using his own force against him. The movement was so quick and precise that Johnson found himself stumbling forward, off balance and confused about what had just happened. Before he could recover, Sarah's left hand struck him in the solar plexus with just enough force to knock the wind out of him without causing permanent damage. He doubled over, gasping for breath. His face turning red as he struggled to understand how the situation had reversed itself so quickly. Rodriguez reacted next, reaching out to grab her arm, but Sarah was already moving. She ducked under his grasp while sweeping her leg behind his knees, sending him tumbling backward over a nearby chair. The sound of his body hitting the floor echoed through the silent mess hall like a gunshot. Mitchell and Barnes tried to coordinate their attack, coming at her from both sides simultaneously, but their lack of real training was immediately obvious. Sarah sidestepped Mitchell's clumsy lunge, using his momentum to send him crashing into the table she had been sitting at. His impact sent trays and utensils flying in all directions, the metal clatter adding to the chaos of the moment. Barnes managed to get closer than the others, actually laying a hand on her shoulder before Sarah spun around and delivered a precise strike to a nerve cluster in his neck. He froze mid-motion, his eyes wide with surprise and confusion as temporary paralysis spread through his upper body, and he collapsed to his knees, unable to understand why his body was no longer responding to his commands. Patterson, seeing 4 of his friends neutralized in a matter of seconds, hesitated for just a moment too long. Sarah turned to face him, her expression calm and professional despite the violence that had just unfolded around her. He looked into her eyes and saw something that made him take an involuntary step backward. "I really wouldn't recommend it," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from absolute confidence in one's abilities. "Your friends made a serious error in judgment, and I'd hate to see you make the same mistake." Patterson looked around at his companions. Johnson still gasping for breath, Rodriguez groaning on the floor, Mitchell dazed and confused amid the scattered dishes, and Barnes kneeling helplessly as sensation slowly returned to his limbs. The entire confrontation had taken less than 40 seconds from start to finish, and what had begun as 5 against 1 had become a one-sided demonstration of professional combat skills versus amateur aggression. The mess hall remained completely silent, every person in the room staring at Sarah with a mixture of shock, awe, and sudden respect. The woman they had dismissed as just another new arrival had just single-handedly neutralized 5 aggressive men without breaking a sweat or even appearing particularly concerned about the outcome. Patterson raised his hands slowly, palms facing outward in the universal gesture of surrender. The bravado that had fueled his participation in the confrontation had evaporated completely, replaced by a dawning understanding that he and his friends had made a catastrophic miscalculation about their intended victim. Sarah stood in the center of the chaos they had created, her breathing steady and controlled, not even slightly winded from the brief but decisive encounter. Her uniform was still perfectly neat, her posture relaxed, as if she had just finished a routine training exercise rather than single-handedly defeating 5 opponents in actual combat. The silence in the mess hall was broken by the sound of rapid footsteps as several senior non-commissioned officers rushed into the room, alerted by reports of a fight in progress. Master Chief Petty Officer Williams, the senior enlisted advisor for the base, surveyed the scene with experienced eyes, taking in the scattered men, the overturned furniture, and the one person still standing calmly in the middle of it all. "What in the hell happened here?" Williams demanded, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from 3 decades of military service and very little patience for nonsense from junior personnel. Johnson, who had finally managed to catch his breath, struggled to his feet while pointing an accusatory finger at Sarah. "She attacked us," he gasped, his face still flushed from his encounter with the floor and his wounded pride. "We were just trying to welcome her to the base, and she went crazy and assaulted all of us." Williams looked from Johnson to Sarah, his experienced eye taking note of several important details. Johnson and his friends all showed clear signs of having been in a fight. Disheveled uniforms, bruises beginning to form, and the kind of shaken demeanor that suggested they had been on the receiving end of something they hadn't expected. Sarah, by contrast, appeared completely composed, her uniform still regulation perfect, no signs of exertion or distress. Rodriguez had managed to get back to his feet, though he was moving gingerly and holding his back where he had impacted with the chair. "That's right," he said, supporting his friend's version of events. "She started threatening us, and when Johnson tried to calm her down, she just exploded into violence." Master Chief Williams had been dealing with military personnel for long enough to recognize when he was being fed a story that didn't match the physical evidence in front of him. 5 men claiming to have been attacked by one woman, yet none of them showed signs of having landed a single blow on their supposed attacker, while she appeared completely unruffled by the encounter. "Is that so?" Williams said, his tone suggesting he had serious doubts about their version of events. He turned to address the other personnel in the mess hall, many of whom were still staring at the scene with obvious fascination. "Did anyone else witness what happened here?" There was a moment of uncomfortable silence, as the observers realized they were being asked to potentially contradict the story being told by Johnson's group. Military culture often discouraged getting involved in other people's conflicts, but several witnesses had seen enough to know that the official version being presented was completely false. Petty Officer First Class Martinez, a senior enlisted woman who had been sitting near the front of the mess hall, stepped forward reluctantly. "Master Chief," she said, her voice careful but clear, "I saw the whole thing. Those 5 men surrounded her table while she was trying to eat, made threats about training accidents, and then Johnson tried to physically assault her. She only defended herself after they initiated contact." Her testimony was corroborated by murmurs of agreement from several other witnesses, and Williams could see the truth of the situation becoming clear despite the attempts to obscure it. Johnson's face reddened further as he realized that his attempt to control the narrative was failing. "That's not how it happened," Mitchell protested, though his voice lacked conviction. He was still feeling the effects of his collision with the table, and his attempt to appear authoritative was undermined by the fact that he was swaying slightly on his feet. Barnes, who had regained most of the feeling in his upper body, tried a different approach. "Look, maybe things got a little heated, but 5 against 1? Come on, Master Chief, does that really seem believable? How could one person do this to all of us unless she had some kind of weapon or something?" It was a reasonable question from his perspective, and Williams found himself looking more closely at Sarah, trying to understand how such a lopsided outcome had been possible. She was clearly fit and appeared confident, but nothing about her suggested the kind of advanced combat training that would be necessary to defeat 5 opponents so decisively. "Ma'am," Williams addressed Sarah directly, "I'm going to need to hear your version of what happened here, and I'm going to need to see some identification." Sarah reached into her uniform pocket and withdrew her military identification card, handing it to Williams with a slight smile that suggested she had been waiting for exactly this moment. "Communications Specialist Second Class Sarah Chen," she said, giving the cover identity that had been established for her mission. "I was just trying to eat my dinner when these gentlemen decided to surround my table and threaten me with training accidents if I didn't show them proper respect." Williams examined her identification carefully, noting that her orders showed a transfer from a classified duty station with most of the details redacted. His years of experience told him that there was more to this woman's story than appeared in her official paperwork, but he also recognized the kind of security classifications that suggested asking too many questions might not be wise. "And how exactly did you manage to defend yourself against 5 attackers?" Williams asked, his tone neutral but clearly expecting a detailed explanation. Sarah's smile widened slightly, and for the first time since the confrontation began, she allowed a hint of her real personality to show through her cover identity. "Master Chief," she said, her voice taking on a tone that was respectful but also carried unmistakable confidence. "Let's just say that my previous duty assignments included some specialized training that prepared me for situations exactly like this one." The vague reference to specialized training was enough to make Williams raise an eyebrow, and he found himself reassessing his initial impression of the woman standing before him. Personnel with truly specialized combat training were usually careful about revealing the extent of their capabilities, and her reluctance to provide specific details actually made her explanation more credible rather than less. Johnson, seeing that the narrative was shifting away from their favor, decided to make one final attempt to salvage the situation. "Specialized training or not," he said, his voice taking on a whining quality that undermined any remaining authority he might have had, "she could have seriously injured us. This is way beyond reasonable self-defense." Williams turned to look at Johnson and his companions, noting that while they had all clearly been roughed up, none of them appeared to have suffered any serious injuries. Rodriguez was moving normally again, Mitchell's dizziness was fading, Barnes had regained full control of his motor functions, and even Johnson seemed to have recovered from his initial shock. "From what I can see," Williams said dryly, "you're all going to live. In fact, I'd say you got off pretty lightly considering you decided to threaten and intimidate a fellow service member during her first day on base." The Master Chief's assessment of the situation was becoming clear, and Johnson could see that his attempt to portray himself and his friends as victims was not going to be successful. The physical evidence, witness testimony, and Williams' own experience all pointed toward the same conclusion. They had picked a fight with the wrong person and paid the price for their poor judgment. "Here's what's going to happen," Williams continued, his voice taking on the kind of tone that indicated his decision was final and non-negotiable. "You 5 are going to report to my office at 800 tomorrow morning to discuss appropriate consequences for threatening a fellow service member and creating a disturbance in the mess hall. And you're going to spend the rest of the evening reflecting on how spectacularly you misjudged this situation." He turned back to Sarah, his expression shifting from stern disciplinarian to something approaching professional respect. "As for you, Specialist Chen, I'd recommend being a little more careful about revealing the extent of your capabilities in the future. Word of this is going to spread throughout the base, and you may find that people treat you differently now." Sarah nodded her understanding, though privately she was pleased with how the situation had developed. Her cover story had held up under scrutiny. She had established herself as someone not to be trifled with, and the incident would likely make her investigation easier by discouraging others from interfering with her activities. "Understood, Master Chief," she replied. "I was hoping to keep a low profile, but sometimes circumstances don't allow for that luxury." Williams caught the subtle implication in her words and filed it away for future consideration. Personnel who talked about keeping low profiles and dealing with circumstances beyond their control usually had more interesting backgrounds than their official paperwork suggested. The crowd in the mess hall began to disperse, though many of the observers continued to steal glances at Sarah as they left. The story of the new communications specialist who had single-handedly defeated 5 aggressive recruits would be all over the base by morning, and her reputation would precede her wherever she went. Johnson and his companions gathered themselves together and left the mess hall with as much dignity as they could manage, though their humiliation was obvious to everyone present. They had learned a harsh lesson about making assumptions based on appearances, and Sarah suspected they would be much more careful about choosing their targets in the future. As the excitement died down and normal conversations resumed throughout the mess hall, Sarah began cleaning up the scattered dishes and overturned furniture from their brief encounter. Several other service members approached to offer assistance, and she found herself receiving nods of respect and approval from personnel who had previously ignored her presence entirely. Master Chief Williams lingered for a few more minutes, ostensibly to ensure that order was fully restored. But Sarah could sense that he was also studying her more carefully now that he had a better understanding of her capabilities. She suspected that her cover story would receive more scrutiny in the coming days, but she was confident that it would hold up under investigation. "Specialist Chen," Williams said as he prepared to leave, "welcome to the base. I have a feeling your assignment here is going to be very interesting." Sarah smiled and nodded her thanks, though she kept to herself the thought that interesting was exactly what she had been hoping for. Her mission to uncover security breaches and equipment theft would be much easier now that she had established herself as someone with serious capabilities and earned the respect of the base personnel. As she finished cleaning up and prepared to leave the mess hall, Sarah reflected on how perfectly the evening had developed. What had started as an unwelcome confrontation with aggressive recruits had turned into an opportunity to establish her credentials and reputation without compromising her cover identity. Sometimes, she thought, the best intelligence operations were the ones that seemed to happen by accident.